They say your wedding day is supposed to be the happiest moment of your life, but nobody warns you that it might also be the day you learn what you're actually worth to the person you loved. I stood at the altar in my wheelchair, white dress pooled around me like melted snow, watching my groom's back disappear through the church doors as 300 guests sat in stunned silence. The flowers I'd spent months choosing suddenly smelled like funeral arrangements. My sister's hand squeezed my shoulder, but I barely felt it through the numbness spreading through my chest like frost. The accident had happened 8 months before the wedding, a drunk driver running a red light that changed everything in the space between one heartbeat and the next. I'd gone from marathon runner to wheelchair user overnight, my spine damaged in ways that meant walking might never be possible again. My fiancé had promised nothing would change, that he loved me regardless, that our wedding would happen exactly as planned. He'd lied about all of it. The whispers started in the front rows and spread backward like ripples in poisoned water. Poor thing. Can you believe he just left? She must be devastated. I wanted to scream at them to stop talking about me like I was already dead, like losing the use of my legs had somehow made me invisible. Instead, I sat frozen in my chair at the altar, the minister's pitying expression making me want to sink into the floor and disappear. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm 26 years old, which is too young to have your entire future crumble while wearing a dress that cost more than your car. I'd met Justin 3 years ago when I was still training for my first marathon, when my body did everything I asked it to without hesitation. He'd been charming and successful, a junior partner at his father's law firm with political ambitions and the kind of smile that made you believe everything he said. We'd planned a future together, mapped out the next 40 years with the confidence of people who thought tragedy was something that happened to other people. The accident had tested that confidence and found it wanting. Justin had been supportive for the first month, visiting the hospital with flowers and encouraging words. By month 2, the visits were shorter, his discomfort more obvious. By month 3, he was suggesting we postpone the wedding, just until you're better, Jenny. As if better was something guaranteed, rather than a distant possibility that required years of painful therapy with no promised outcome. But I'd been stubborn, insisting we keep our date because calling it off felt like admitting defeat. Felt like letting the accident win by taking away not just my mobility but my entire future. So we'd proceeded with plans despite the growing distance between us, despite the way he flinched when people stared at my wheelchair, despite the conversations I'd overheard about how this wasn't what he signed up for. I should have known, should have recognized that his love had conditions I could no longer meet. But hope makes you stupid sometimes, makes you believe in promises that were never as solid as they seemed. Now I sat at an altar decorated with white roses and baby's breath, abandoned in front of everyone I knew. And all I could think was that at least the humiliation would be over soon. Except it wasn't over. Because that's when he walked in. The back doors of the church opened with a sound like thunder, and every head turned toward the man striding down the aisle with the kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black suit that probably cost more than my wedding dress, with dark hair and eyes so pale they looked almost silver in the church's filtered light. I'd never seen him before, but something about the way people leaned away as he passed suggested they knew exactly who he was. Behind him came 4 men in similar dark suits, moving with the synchronized precision of people trained for violence. They positioned themselves strategically around the church, and I realized with cold certainty that this wasn't a confused wedding guest or someone who'd wandered in by mistake. This was someone powerful making a very deliberate entrance. He stopped at the altar, those strange pale eyes sweeping over me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Up close, I could see the scar along his jaw, the way he moved with contained violence that suggested danger barely leashed. He was maybe 32 or 33, devastatingly handsome in a way that felt threatening, like admiring a predator moments before it struck. Jennifer Walsh. His voice was deep, with a slight accent I couldn't place wrapped around my name like he'd said it 1,000 times before. I'm sorry your groom was too much of a coward to see what he had. He extended his hand, not in greeting, but in invitation. Marry me instead. The church erupted in shocked whispers that built into confused shouting. My sister's grip on my shoulder tightened until it hurt. The minister stepped back with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his entire career choice. And I sat there staring at this stranger who'd just proposed marriage in front of 300 witnesses like it was the most normal thing in the world. I don't know you, I finally managed, my voice steadier than my hands that were gripping my chair's wheels hard enough to hurt. Why would you ask me to marry you? You don't know me either. But that didn't stop you from agreeing to marry a man who abandoned you the moment you became inconvenient. His pale eyes held mine with uncomfortable intensity. I'm offering you something he couldn't provide: respect, security, a future that doesn't depend on whether you can walk. The bluntness should have offended me, but there was something almost refreshing about it after months of people tiptoeing around my disability like it was contagious. Still, marrying a stranger because your fiancé abandoned you seemed like the kind of decision that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Who are you? The question came out sharper than intended, fueled by humiliation and confusion and the surreal nature of this entire situation. Because you don't just walk into churches and propose to women you've never met unless you're insane or dangerous or both. My name is Dolly Cross. He said it like I should recognize it, like the name itself carried weight beyond simple introduction. I run most of the profitable operations in Thornfield Heights and several surrounding areas. Your father worked for me before he died, which means I've known about you for years even if we've never formally met. My father. The words hit like physical blows. My father had died when I was 19, a construction accident that the investigators had ruled tragic but preventable. My mother had been devastated, and I'd buried myself in running and school and anything that let me avoid thinking about the hole he'd left in our lives. I'd never known details about his work beyond general contracting, had never thought to question deeper. You knew my father, I repeated, trying to understand the connection. And that makes you think you should marry me? Why? What possible reason could you have for wanting this? Dolly glanced around the church, at the guests who'd come to watch me marry someone else, and were now witnessing something stranger than anything they could have imagined. Then his gaze returned to me, and I saw calculation mixed with something that might have been genuine concern. Because you deserve better than being abandoned at your own wedding. Because your father asked me to look after you if anything happened to him, and I've failed that responsibility by not intervening sooner. His voice dropped lower, meant only for me. And because I need a wife, and you need someone who won't run when life gets difficult. It's a transaction that benefits both of us, if you're brave enough to accept it. A transaction. Not a love story or a rescue or a fairy tale, but a business arrangement being proposed at the worst moment of my life. I should have told him to leave, should have wheeled myself out of this church and dealt with the humiliation in private. Should have done anything except consider what he was offering. But the truth was, I had nowhere to go. The apartment I'd shared with Justin was his, paid for by his family. My job as a physical therapist had been put on hold during my recovery, and my savings were nearly depleted from medical bills insurance hadn't covered. My mother lived in a tiny apartment that barely accommodated her, let alone me and my wheelchair. I'd been dependent on Justin's support because I'd trusted his promises, and now those promises were as worthless as the ring I was still wearing. Dolly seemed to read my thoughts in my silence. I'm not asking you to love me, Jennifer. I'm asking you to make a choice. About your future. Marry me, and I'll provide everything you need. Medical care, therapy, housing, independence. His pale eyes held mine with uncomfortable honesty. Or don't, and figure out how to rebuild your life from nothing while everyone in this church spends the next year pitying you. The choice is yours. But I need an answer now. Why now? My voice came out as barely a whisper. Why does it have to be right now in front of all these people? Because if you walk out of here unmarried after being abandoned, that humiliation follows you forever. Dolly gestured around the church. Everyone here came expecting a wedding. Give them one, just not the one they anticipated. Show them that Jennifer Walsh doesn't break when life gets hard. She adapts. My sister leaned down, her voice urgent in my ear. Jenny, you can't seriously be considering this. You don't know anything about him. He could be dangerous. This could be worse than what Justin did. She was right, of course. This was insane. Reckless. The kind of decision that reasonable people didn't make, that would probably end badly no matter how I looked at it. But I was tired of being reasonable. Tired of being pitied. Tired of being the poor, disabled girl who got left at the altar. If I was going to be talked about, I might as well give them something worth discussing. I looked at Dolly Cross, this stranger with pale eyes and contained violence, and made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing how far down the ground was. Yes. The word came out stronger than I expected. I'll marry you. But I have conditions. His smile was sharp enough to cut. Of course you do. That's exactly why this will work. Name them. I want to continue my physical therapy without interference. I want to finish my degree and go back to work when I'm ready. I want financial independence, not just an allowance you can cut off whenever I displease you. Each demand came out more forcefully than the last, fueled by anger and desperation and determination not to trade one cage for another. And I want respect, not pity. If you can't treat me like an equal despite this wheelchair, then this doesn't work regardless of what transaction you think you're making. Dolly extended his hand again. Agreed to all of it. Now take my hand and let's give these people the wedding they came for. Just not the groom they expected. I took his hand, feeling calluses that spoke of violence survived rather than avoided, feeling the warmth and strength of fingers that could probably break bones without effort. He pulled me to standing with surprising gentleness, supporting my weight as I balanced on legs that barely worked, that required all my concentration not to collapse. The church went silent. 300 people holding their collective breath as this stranger who'd interrupted my humiliation guided me through the ceremony I'd planned for someone else. The minister, clearly deciding that bizarre was better than tragic, began the traditional words with a voice that shook only slightly. I barely heard them. Was too focused on staying upright, on not collapsing in front of everyone, on the surreal reality that I was marrying a man whose last name I'd learned 5 minutes ago. Dolly's grip was steady, his presence solid beside me, and when the minister asked if he took me as his wife, his yes was clear and firm and absolute. When it was my turn, I hesitated. This was the last moment I could change my mind, could refuse, and deal with the consequences alone. Could choose pride over practicality, and figure out my future without tying it to a stranger who spoke of transactions and territories, like he was negotiating business rather than marriage. But then I thought about Justin's back disappearing through those doors, about the pity in everyone's eyes, about starting over with nothing except damaged legs and depleted savings. Thought about Dolly's promise of respect and independence, and a future that didn't require walking. I do. The words felt like surrender and defiance simultaneously, like giving up one kind of freedom to gain another, like making a choice that would either save me or destroy me, and I wouldn't know which until it was too late to matter. Dolly's kiss was brief and professional, the seal on a contract rather than a display of affection. But his hand stayed steady on my waist, keeping me upright, And when he helped me back into my wheelchair, he did it with an efficiency that suggested genuine understanding rather than discomfort. Then he turned to address the church, his voice carrying authority that demanded attention. "I know this wasn't the wedding you expected." His pale eyes swept across the stunned guests with something like amusement. "But Jennifer and I have known each other's families for years, and we decided that her happiness was more important than following someone else's plan. I hope you'll join us for the reception and celebrate this new beginning." The audacity of it, the smooth lie delivered with such confidence that people actually started nodding, actually started convincing themselves that maybe this had been planned, that maybe I hadn't just married a complete stranger out of desperation and spite. My mother stood in the third row, her face pale with shock and confusion, and I mouthed, "I'm sorry," to her, because I didn't have words to explain what I'd just done. The reception was surreal, held in the venue Justin and I had booked months ago, decorated with flowers and lights that were meant to celebrate a different marriage entirely. Dolly's men had smoothly transitioned everything, making calls that transformed confused caterers into professionals who acted like nothing unusual had happened. Guests who'd come to witness my humiliation now chatted awkwardly about the unexpected turn of events, creating narratives that made sense to them even if those narratives bore no resemblance to reality. I sat at the head table beside my new husband, my wheelchair positioned where Justin's chair should have been, trying to process everything that had happened in the space of an hour. Dolly had removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and was fielding conversations with various guests who approached with congratulations that sounded forced but were gradually becoming more genuine. He played the role of devoted groom with surprising skill, his hand finding mine at appropriate moments, his smile warm in ways his eyes never quite managed. When we were finally alone for a moment, I turned to him with questions that had been building since I'd said those impossible words. "Why did you really do this?" "The truth. Not the story you told everyone in the church. Because my father asking you to look after me doesn't explain why you'd marry me. There's more to this." Dolly studied me with those unsettling pale eyes. "You're right. There's always more." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping the reception like he was cataloging threats. "I'm 33 years old with enemies who'd love nothing more than to find a weakness they can exploit. I need stability, legitimacy, someone who won't betray me because they're dependent on my protection, rather than in it for power or money." He looked at me directly. "You need security and resources to rebuild your life. I need a wife who understands transactions rather than romance. It's practical for both of us. So I'm what? A shield against your enemies?" My voice came out harder than intended. "A prop you can use to look stable and legitimate while you do whatever illegal things you do? Because that's not respect, Dolly. That's being used in a different way than Justin was using me. You're a partner in a mutually beneficial arrangement." His voice was calm but firm. "I'm not asking you to be a prop, Jennifer. I'm asking you to be someone who shares my life, who raises children if that's something you want, who helps me navigate social situations that require a couple rather than a single man. In exchange, I provide everything I promised: medical care, independence, protection." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And unlike your previous fiancé, I won't leave when things get difficult. Because difficulty is something I understand and respect, not something that makes me uncomfortable." The music started, slow and romantic, and couples began moving onto the dance floor. Dolly stood, extending his hand again. "Dance with me. It's expected, and it'll show everyone that we're a genuine couple rather than whatever strange arrangement they're imagining." "I can't dance." The words came out bitter. "In case you hadn't noticed, my legs don't work properly. I can barely stand, let alone move around a dance floor." "Who said anything about you needing to use your legs?" Dolly lifted me from my wheelchair with surprising ease, supporting my weight as he carried me onto the dance floor. His arm wrapped around my waist, holding me against him, and he moved us both in a slow circle. That looked like dancing even though my feet barely touched the ground. You let me handle the movement, you just hold on. It should have been humiliating, being carried around a dance floor like a child. But somehow it wasn't. Somehow, with Dolly's steady strength supporting me and his hand warm against my back, it felt almost normal. Almost like I was just a bride dancing with her groom at her wedding, rather than a disabled woman being physically carried through a mockery of romance. Around us, other couples joined the dance floor, and I caught my sister's eye. She was watching with an expression I couldn't read, concern mixed with something that might have been cautious approval. My mother stood at the edge of the room, tears streaming down her face, and I couldn't tell if they were tears of relief or worry. When the song ended, Dolly returned me to my wheelchair with the same gentle efficiency he'd shown at the altar. Then he knelt beside my chair, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I know this isn't what you planned. I know accepting my proposal was desperation rather than desire. But I promise you, Jennifer, I will never make you regret choosing me over being alone. His pale eyes held mine with uncomfortable intensity. This marriage may have started as a transaction, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We can build something real if you're willing to try. I didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't know if I believed him or if this was just another version of the promises Justin had made before showing his true nature. So I just nodded, let him take my hand again as we greeted guests, and smiled for photographs that would forever mark this strangest day of my life. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of forced congratulations and awkward conversations. People who'd known about my engagement to Justin tried to reconcile this dramatic shift with their understanding of who I was. Relatives asked questions I couldn't answer about how Dolly and I had reconnected, about why we'd kept our relationship secret, about plans for a future I hadn't even begun to consider. Dolly handled most of it with smooth lies that grew more elaborate with each telling, creating a backstory for our relationship that sounded almost plausible if you didn't think too hard about the timeline. By the time the reception ended, I was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical, emotionally drained from processing trauma and making impossible choices, and trying to pretend everything was fine when my entire life had been turned upside down twice in the same day. Dolly's car was waiting outside, a black sedan that screamed money and power, with a driver who helped me into the back seat, while Dolly folded my wheelchair and stored it in the trunk. "Where are we going?" I asked as the car pulled away from the venue. "Because I don't have anything with me, no clothes or medications or any of the things I'd need if we're actually going to wherever you live." "Home." Dolly's voice was matter of fact. "My home, which is now your home as well. I've already had people collect your belongings from your previous apartment. Everything you need will be there, including medical equipment and anything else that was on the list your physical therapist provided." The casual mention of my physical therapist's list made me turn sharply toward him. "How did you get that information? How long have you been planning this?" "Long enough to be prepared." His expression was unreadable in the dim light. "I told you, Jennifer. I've known about you for years. Your father asked me to watch over you, and I've honored that request even if you didn't know I was doing it. When I learned about your accident, I made arrangements in case you ever needed help." His gaze met mine. "Today just happened to be the day you needed it most." It should have felt invasive, knowing he'd been monitoring my life without my knowledge. Should have made me angry that he'd collected information about me like I was a project to be managed. But I was too tired to be angry, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened to process one more violation of my privacy. The house, when we arrived, was more of a mansion. 3 stories of modern architecture and strategic security, set back from the street behind gates that suggested the kind of wealth and paranoia that went hand in hand with whatever business Dolly conducted. Inside was even more impressive, all clean lines and expensive furniture and artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses. But what caught my attention was the ramp leading to the front entrance, the elevator clearly installed for accessibility, the way the first floor seemed designed to accommodate wheelchairs without making them obvious. "You renovated for me." The realization made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. "Before today, before I even agreed to marry you, you changed your house to accommodate a wheelchair user." Dolly helped me out of the car with practiced ease. "I told you, I've been prepared for this possibility for a while. Your room is on the first floor with an attached bathroom that's fully accessible. There's a gym with equipment your physical therapist recommended, and I've hired someone to continue your therapy sessions here if you prefer privacy over going to a clinic." His hand rested briefly on my shoulder. "You're not a burden I'm tolerating, Jennifer. You're a person who deserves accommodation, and I have the resources to provide it." That night, I lay in a bed bigger and more comfortable than anything I'd ever experienced, in a room decorated with surprising taste and care, and tried to understand what I'd done. I'd married a stranger out of desperation and spite, had committed my future to someone who spoke of enemies and territories, who clearly operated outside legal boundaries, but had shown me more genuine consideration in 6 hours than my fiancé had in 6 months. It was insane, reckless, the kind of decision that couldn't possibly end well. But as I stared at the ceiling of my new bedroom, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the accident: hope. Fragile and uncertain and probably foolish, but hope nonetheless. Maybe Dolly Cross was dangerous. Maybe I'd made a terrible mistake. But at least I'd made a choice, had taken control of my future rather than letting circumstances control me. And maybe, just maybe, that was worth whatever consequences came next. The morning after my wedding, I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee drifting through the house. For a moment, I thought I'd dreamed everything, that yesterday's chaos had been some fever-induced nightmare. Then I saw my wedding dress hanging on the closet door, evidence of impossible choices and stranger-turned husband, and reality crashed back with uncomfortable force. Dolly found me struggling to transfer from bed to wheelchair, my morning routine always the hardest when muscles were stiff from sleep. He didn't comment on my frustration, just positioned the chair where I needed it and offered a hand I was too proud to take. "Stubborn independence," he observed without judgment. "Your father had the same quality, made him excellent at his job because he never quit, even when quitting would have been smarter." We had breakfast in a dining room that overlooked gardens I hadn't noticed last night. Dolly ate efficiently while reading something on his phone, occasionally answering calls in a language I didn't recognize. Watching him, I realized how little I actually knew about the man I'd married. Where he'd grown up, what he actually did, whether the violence I sensed in him was real, or just my imagination creating threats where none existed. "What happens now?" I finally asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between us. "Do we just pretend to be a normal married couple, or is there something else I should be doing to fulfill whatever bargain we made?" Dolly set down his phone, giving me his full attention. "Now we build a life that works for both of us. You continue your therapy and education. I continue my business operations. We attend social functions together when necessary, present a united front to people who need to believe we're a legitimate couple." His pale eyes held mine. "And we learn each other, figure out how to coexist in ways that don't drive us both crazy." Sounds romantic. The sarcasm came automatically, defense mechanism against vulnerability. Most marriages start with love and figure out compatibility later. We're doing it backward. Maybe that makes us smarter. Dolly's smile was slight but genuine. Love makes people stupid, makes them overlook incompatibilities because feelings cloud judgment. We're building something based on mutual need and respect, which seems more stable than romance that fades when reality intrudes. He stood, moving to the window. Give it 6 months, Jennifer. 6 months to decide if this arrangement works for you. If it doesn't, if you find this life intolerable, I'll arrange an annulment and ensure you're financially secure regardless. No penalties, no consequences. Just a clean separation and resources to start over however you choose. The offer was more generous than I'd expected, more genuine consideration than I'd received from someone who claimed to love me. It made Dolly Cross more complicated than the dangerous stranger who'd proposed in a church. Made him someone with honor buried beneath the violence and power. I'll give you 6 months. My voice was steadier than my emotions. But I need to understand what I've gotten into, who you really are beyond the smooth lies you told everyone yesterday. The whole truth, not sanitized versions designed to make me feel safe. Fair enough. Dolly returned to the table, his expression serious. I run an organization that controls most illegal operations in Thornfield Heights and surrounding territories. Gambling, protection services, some smuggling. I employ about 200 people directly and influence thousands more. His honesty was almost jarring. I also run legitimate businesses that employ another 300 people in construction, real estate, and hospitality. Most of my wealth comes from legal sources now, but the foundation was built on criminal enterprise, and I can't fully separate from that world without losing everything I've created. So you're what the media would call a crime boss. I tried to keep my voice neutral, tried not to show the fear that information generated. My father worked for a criminal, and now I'm married to one. Dolly's expression didn't change. Your father knew exactly who he worked for and chose to anyway, because I paid fairly and treated my people well. He wasn't an innocent caught up in corruption, Jennifer. He was a willing participant who made peace with moral ambiguity because it provided for his family. The truth about my father hurt more than I wanted to admit. I'd always thought of him as a simple construction worker, honest and hardworking. Learning he'd been part of Dolly's world, had chosen that life knowingly, made me question everything I'd believed about him. Did he know you'd eventually try to marry me? Was that part of his agreement with you? No. The certainty in Dolly's voice was absolute. Your father asked me to watch over you if something happened to him, to make sure you were safe and had opportunities. He never suggested marriage, never imagined I'd take that level of responsibility. His pale eyes held mine. Marrying you was my decision, made for my own reasons as much as to honor his request. The front door opened before I could respond, and a woman in her 50s entered with the confidence of someone who belonged here. She was elegant in a sharp business suit, with gray hair styled professionally, and eyes that assessed me with the same intensity Dolly used. This is Margaret, Dolly introduced. She manages most of my legitimate business operations and serves as my second in command for everything that requires someone with better social skills than I possess. Margaret extended her hand, which I shook automatically. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Cross. I've heard interesting things about yesterday's wedding. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Dolly has never been one for traditional approaches, but I have to say, interrupting someone else's wedding to claim his bride was bold even for him. I'm not his bride by choice, I felt compelled to clarify. This is a business arrangement, a transaction that benefits both of us. Let's not pretend it's something romantic. Margaret's smile became more genuine. Good. That means you're practical, rather than delusional. Dolly needs someone who understands reality rather than chasing fairy tales. She sat across from us, pulling out a tablet. Now, let's discuss the practical aspects of your new position. You'll need to attend certain social functions as Dolly's wife, which means appropriate wardrobe, training in how to navigate conversations without revealing sensitive information, and understanding of who can be trusted versus who's gathering intelligence for competitors. The next 3 hours were overwhelming, a crash course in being married to someone powerful and dangerous. Margaret explained the social hierarchy of Dolly's world, the families and organizations that were allies versus enemies, the subtle ways people would try to use me for information or leverage. She showed me photographs of key players I needed to recognize, explaining each person's role and relationship to Dolly. Some of it felt like spy training, some like finishing school for criminals' wives. All of it was surreal for someone who'd been a physical therapist focusing on helping patients recover mobility. By the time Margaret left, my head was spinning with names and faces and warnings about trust. Dolly had disappeared somewhere during the briefing, leaving me alone to process everything. I wheeled myself through the house, exploring my new environment and trying to understand how my life had become this strange combination of luxury and danger. The gym Margaret had mentioned was better equipped than the hospital where I'd done my initial rehabilitation. Top-of-the-line equipment designed specifically for people rebuilding strength and mobility. Everything I'd need to continue the progress I'd made before the wedding disaster. Someone had even posted my therapy schedule on the wall, along with goals my physical therapist had set before my world imploded. I was attempting to use the parallel bars, trying to force my legs to cooperate for short walking exercises, when Dolly found me. He didn't interrupt, just watched from the doorway as I struggled through movements that were supposed to be getting easier but felt harder every day. When I finally gave up, frustration making my eyes burn with tears I refused to shed, he moved closer. "How bad is it?" The question was direct. No dancing around difficult topics. The doctors gave you odds on recovery. What are they? 30% chance I'll walk again with full mobility. Another 40% I'll regain enough function to walk short distances with assistance. 30% I'll remain primarily wheelchair dependent for life. The numbers came out flat, clinical, the same way my doctors had delivered them. I'm 8 months into rehabilitation, which means I'm running out of time for major improvements. Whatever function I don't recover in the next year, I probably never will. And your previous fiancé couldn't handle that uncertainty. It wasn't a question, just acknowledgement of obvious truth. He needed guarantees you couldn't provide, needed to know his wife would eventually be able to walk beside him at political functions and charity events. Dolly's voice carried disgust. He needed you to fit his image, rather than accepting who you actually are. I turned my chair to face him directly. "And you're different? You don't care that your wife might never walk, that people will always stare, that I'll always require accommodation? You're really telling me none of that bothers you?" "I'm telling you, I knew all those things before I asked you to marry me." Dolly moved closer, kneeling so we were eye level. "I didn't propose hoping you'd eventually walk again, Jennifer. I proposed knowing you might not, accepting that reality before I made the offer. Your disability isn't something I'm tolerating or overcoming. It's just part of who you are, the same way my scars are part of who I am." His hand covered mine on the wheelchair grip. "We're both damaged in different ways. Difference is, I don't see your damage as a deficit." The intensity of his words, the absolute certainty in his voice, made something crack in my chest. I'd been holding myself together through force of will since the accident, refusing to break down because breaking down meant admitting defeat. But something in Dolly's acceptance, in his matter-of-fact acknowledgement that my disability was simply a fact rather than a failure, broke through my defenses. I cried then, really cried for the first time since waking up in a hospital bed, unable to feel my legs. Cried for the future I'd lost, for the man who'd abandoned me, for the strange bargain I'd made with a stranger. Dolly didn't try to comfort me with platitudes or false promises. just stayed kneeling beside my chair, his hand steady on mine, letting me fall apart without judgment. When the tears finally stopped, I felt emptied but somehow lighter, like releasing the grief I'd been holding had made space for something new, something that might eventually become hope. I'm sorry. My voice was rough from crying. That was unprofessional for someone in a business arrangement. Don't apologize for being human. Dolly stood, offering his hand to help me up. And Jennifer? This might have started as a transaction, but that doesn't mean it has to stay purely business. We're allowed to care about each other as people, not just as parties in an arrangement. Over the next 3 months, we built something that resembled a marriage, even if it didn't feel like the marriages I'd imagined. Dolly worked long hours, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark. But he always had breakfast with me and made time for dinner when he was in town. We talked about everything from philosophy to current events to childhood memories, learning each other in ways that felt more intimate than physical connection. He accompanied me to physical therapy sessions, not hovering but present, asking intelligent questions about my progress and advocating for treatments my insurance had denied. He hired the best specialists, flew in experts from other cities, gave me access to experimental therapies that showed promise even if they weren't guaranteed. Not because he expected miracles, but because he wanted me to have every possible option for recovery. I attended social functions at his side, learning to navigate conversations with people who were friendly to my face, but calculating behind their smiles. Margaret coached me through these events, teaching me how to deflect personal questions and redirect conversations away from dangerous topics. I became adept at being Dolly's wife in public, while remaining uncertain about what we were in private. The physical relationship developed slowly, almost inevitably. 3 months after our wedding, after an evening spent at a charity gala where I'd successfully managed challenging conversations with several of Dolly's business associates, we returned home, and the tension that had been building between us finally broke. What happened that night was nothing like my previous experience with intimacy. Dolly approached physical connection with the same intensity he brought to everything else, but also with surprising gentleness. He was patient with my body's limitations, creative in finding ways that worked despite my mobility issues, focused on my pleasure in ways that made me feel seen and valued rather than tolerated. Afterward, lying in his bed with his arm around me and my head on his chest, I realized I'd stopped thinking of this as a transaction somewhere along the way. Had started caring about him as a person, rather than just as the man who'd saved me from humiliation. It should have terrified me, this growing attachment to someone dangerous. Instead, it felt like coming home. The 6-month deadline arrived faster than I expected. 6 months of learning to be Dolly's wife, and discovering that the man behind the dangerous reputation was more complicated than I'd imagined. He was capable of violence, yes. I'd seen hints of it in the way his men feared him, in the scars he carried, in the calls he took in other rooms when he thought I wasn't paying attention. But he was also capable of surprising kindness, of consideration that went beyond simple obligation. At breakfast on the exact 6-month anniversary of our wedding, Dolly set down his coffee and looked at me with those pale eyes that had become familiar. 6 months. His voice was carefully neutral. Time to decide if you want to stay, or if you'd prefer the annulment I promised. No judgment either way, Jennifer. You've fulfilled the initial agreement, and I'll honor my commitment to your financial security regardless of your choice. I studied him across the table, this man who'd interrupted my worst day and somehow turned it into something that resembled happiness. Thought about the life we'd built, the conversations we'd shared, the way he looked at me like I mattered beyond my utility to his image. Thought about going back to living alone, starting over without him, trying to rebuild independence I'd already found within the structure of our arrangement. I don't want an annulment. The words came out steady, certain in ways I hadn't expected. This isn't what I planned, isn't the marriage I imagined when I was younger and stupider. But it's real in ways that fairy tale romance never was. You see me, Dolly. Not the disability, not the damaged legs, but me. And I see you too, beyond the danger and the power to the person underneath. His smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in ways his usual expressions never did. Good, because somewhere in the past 6 months, this stopped being a transaction for me too. His hand found mine across the table. I love you, Jennifer. Not because you're convenient or useful, but because you're strong and smart, and refuse to let anything, including your own body's limitations, define your worth. I love you too. The admission felt like surrender and victory simultaneously. Like acknowledging I'd fallen for the man who'd saved me from humiliation by offering a transaction that became something infinitely more valuable. We were building an empire together. Strange and unconventional, but ours nonetheless. Dolly had said he needed an heir, needed a wife who understood transactions rather than romance. But what we'd created went beyond those initial requirements. We'd found partnership in the truest sense. Two damaged people building something beautiful from the wreckage of our individual traumas. The love that grew between us wasn't the fairy tale I'd once imagined. It was something harder won, forged in honesty and acceptance, and the daily choice to see each other clearly. And that made it more valuable than any romantic fantasy could ever be. Looking back on that day at the altar, on the moment Dolly had walked into the church and offered me an impossible choice, I realized he'd given me something far more precious than rescue. He'd given me the chance to choose myself, to claim agency over my future even when that future looked nothing like what I'd planned. We stood together now, building a life that combined his dangerous world with my determination to help others through physical therapy work I'd resumed. Building a family, because somewhere along the way, we'd decided that children were something we wanted rather than just heirs Dolly needed. Building a future that honored both our strengths and our damages. Some people dreamed of fairy tale weddings with Prince Charming sweeping them off their feet. I'd gotten something better. A man who saw me at my lowest moment and offered partnership instead of pity. A man who knelt beside my wheelchair not to save me, but to stand with me as an equal. A man who'd taken my hand at an altar and promised a transaction that became the greatest love story I never knew I needed. That was worth more than any perfect wedding day could ever be.